This morning we want to begin a new series called The Compass. And this is a series on getting direction for our lives. And so if you know somebody in your life or in your circle of influence that is looking for direction in your life, be sure to invite them to the next several week services, because we're going to be talking about things that practically and biblically that can help you navigate and make decisions in your life. You know, questions are a powerful thing. And I don't know if you've ever paid attention to this, but questions have the power to teach and to reach and to guide at a level that statements can't. When you really are in a difficult conversation with somebody, I challenge you, just begin to ask questions. If you don't know somebody and you get nervous, some people get nervous when they introduce themselves to somebody. They get nervous, want to put their best foot forward. If you're that kind of person, more introverted, and you want to be able to socialize better, just begin to get a series of questions in your head. Ask the 5 W's and H's: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Just begin to ask questions. It's amazing what questions can do. They have the ability to draw people out and to connect people, and they also have the ability to teach and reach where statements cannot. I want you to think about how fast kids learn. Children learn pretty fast. I mean, we're watching this afresh as we watch our grandson, Jason, grow up. You know, he from birth till now, he's 18 months, and it's amazing as we look at what he's learned. And he's now beginning to talk and beginning to learn words. He's learning words every week. Patty, what was that word? It was a word he learned last week. I'm getting older. I'm forgetting words. Heart. He learned the word heart. Patty had these heart-shaped earrings, and she was able to get him to connect that to a drawing he had seen. And he said, heart, heart. And it's amazing. Language is fascinating. Patty was a speech pathologist by trade, and so she has taught people how to speak. In fact, she taught me how to speak well. And I couldn't preach my way out of a wet paper bag when I was younger until I met Patty. And so we've always been fascinated because she'll tell me things like insufficient velar pharyngeal closure. You got insufficient velar pharyngeal closure. Doesn't sound good, does it? Ooh. All it means is you speak nasal. You know, but I listen to all these terms. That's the only one I can remember. So whenever I go to a party with her, I'd say, yeah, I think that guy's got insufficient velar pharyngeal closure. All you have to learn is one or two things. But, you know, questions work better than statements like that when you're in questions. And so as you look at kids and you see how they learn, one of the reasons that kids learn so fast is they ask a lot of questions. In fact, one study says that the average 4-year-old child asks 437 questions every day. No wonder moms are tired. She's been answering questions all day long. Well, you know who else asked a lot of questions? Jesus. Jesus asked, according to one study, and I've never counted them. In fact, their homework assignment is for all of you to read through the Gospels and record every question, see if this number's right. But according to this one source, Jesus asked 307 questions in the 4 Gospels, let alone the questions in the Bible. You know, the Bible starts out in Genesis 3 with a question: Adam, where are you? Questions have the power to connect and locate and teach and reach where statements never could. Jesus asked 187 questions. And Jesus answered only 3 to 13 questions, depending on how you count. Now, I want you to think about that. That means that Jesus was asked almost twice as many questions as he asked. And that Jesus only answered 1% or less of the questions he was asked. Now, I want you to think about that. In other words, Jesus gave us a lot more questions than he gave answers to questions. How could that be? Question. Why did he do that? Question. Because questions have the ability, first of all, to disarm us. When we make a statement and somebody doesn't like it, what happens? Their defenses go up. And so when we ask questions, it invites a person into a conversation. It engages their heart and their mind. They have to begin to think about it and begin to pursue Paul, wherever Paul is. They have to begin to pursue an answer. And so Jesus used questions to teach. Now, he made a lot of statements. He teaches a lot in the Gospels. But somewhere around 300 questions, because that might not be exact, but I know I've read the New Testament. There's a lot of questions in there. Now, we're going to start a series called The Compass. We live in a GPS world, where you can, if you want direction, we've kind of gotten lazy. You just get your phone out, or you get a GPS out, and you just plug in the address, and it gives you a route, and you can print the route out, or you can just follow it as it goes along, and some British lady says, turn left now. Kind of annoying. She's telling some British woman telling me what to do all the time. But when I was growing up, if you wanted to go somewhere, you needed a map. Remember those days? And Rand McNally. You got a map, and some of you, when you were getting direction, it was written on stone. Now, mine was written on parchment, but that's a different story. Or a compass. Remember being in the Boy Scouts or the Cub Scouts, and you had to learn how to read a compass. And that's what we call in this series. It's called The Compass, because the Bible doesn't give us a GPS. Now, we do have the Holy Spirit, but still, we're going to have to learn some things. We're going to have to learn to read the compass that God has given us to get direction. And so the compass has 4 points on it, as you know, north, south, east, and west. But what's great about a compass is a compass always points north. And that's what we have to find out in our lives. You see, every one of you have what Bill George calls a true north. There is a direction that you've been wired to go. Now, sin has impacted that, and I don't have time to get into the fall and how that impacts sin and all that from the theological standpoint. But even though we're fallen creatures, God has put in our heart a sense of direction that we have to figure out. And you'll see as we make the connections in our sermon this morning that this is true. You see, we live in a crazy, hectic, complicated world. We now face decisions that generations past did not have to make. I mean, with technology in itself, we face end-of-life issues that were never faced by mankind before. I mean, we can keep people alive even when they've really passed. We can keep people alive on machines, and people are faced with it. I've had to walk with people as a pastor through the process of making very difficult decisions that I wish were black and white, but man, they're very complicated now. And how do you make those decisions? And of course, younger people have to decide whether they go to college or not go to college, or where they work, and they have to decide, do they get married? Who do they get married? Where do they live? And all through life, we have a series, and life gets complicated. And I wish that God just sent an angel to stand beside us every day and say, go left here, go right there, like the British lady. Turn left here, marry that person, don't marry that person. Get a job. Pay your tithe. Pay your tithe. Pay your tithe. That one's from devil, right? No. It'd be nice if it worked that way, or if you got visions, from God, and that would be nice. But I have to be honest, even as a pastor, and I'm doing God's work, there's been a lot of times I just have to make decisions. How do you make those decisions? Now, Bill George calls our true north an internal compass that guides you successfully through your life. It represents who you are as a human being at your deepest level. It is your orienting point, he says. It's your fixed point in a spinning world that helps you stay on track. I like to call it your North Star. When you go out at night, I do this particularly in the fall when it begins to get cold, because it seems like when the air is so crisp, you can see the stars better. And I'll look up at the Big Dipper and I'll find the North Star, and it's always in the north. And every one of us have a north point, a true north, a north star that kind of helps us figure out where we're going, because it's who we are. George goes on to write, he says, our true north is based on what is most important to you, your most cherished values, your passions and motivations, the sources of your satisfaction in life. And so we're going to do 4 messages in this series called The Compass, and each one of them is based on a question that you have to answer in order to discover your true north, to be able to navigate your life. And the first question is this: what is really important to you? What is really important to you? What is really important to you? You see, as a pastor, as a type A, I am a type A. I set goals, and the majority of the time, I'm not bragging, I hit them. I'm a type A. I asked my wife, I set a goal, and when she met me, I was setting a goal. I wanted to have $10,000 in the bank before we got married. And so when she met me, I had 2 sets of clothes. On the third date, my wife literally said, she wasn't my wife, she was my girlfriend at the time. She said, "Don't you have any other clothes to wear?" I said, "Absolutely not, but I got money in the bank." That's a type A. Those type A's later become misers, hoarders. You've seen the TV show, Hoarders. That was my future till I met Jesus and my wife and had kids. And you know miser hoarding after you have kids. I can't even keep cookies in the house. I'm not trying to project on you being a type A. But being a type A and being a pastor over these years and helping people to try to figure out how they're going to get through life, one of the things I've noticed is there's a tendency for us as human beings to state that something's pretty important in our lives, but to live as if it's not. That there's a major disconnect in our lives as human beings when we say this is important. Like fathers will say their kids are important, but only spend 5 minutes a day with them. We'll say relationships are important, but we won't stop working long enough to go out to eat with somebody or go to a movie with somebody or go golfing with people. And there's a disconnect. And so one of the things that we have to begin to look at in our lives, first we have to identify what is really important to you. Not me, you. And you need to begin to drill down on that question. What is it really that I would die for? Not kill for. People kill for things that they aren't committed to. But what would you die for? Somebody puts a gun to your head and says, "Is this important to you?" Would you say, "Look, there's a lot of things I wouldn't. Man, I'd compromise all over the place for some things." And so should you. But there should be some things that say, "I can't live without this." What are those things? That's the first question, and it's the question of values. You see, values are simply what is important to us. And every one of you have a set of values, whether you realize or not. If you came into my office, I could work with you to discover your values. I would help you if you can't figure it out. What is important to you? The first question I'd ask, if you can't figure out your values, what ticks you off? What makes you mad? When you begin to watch your pattern of anger, there's a value in there somewhere. And so we're going to look at the life of Moses over these next 4 weeks. And we're going to show you how 4 questions were answered in Moses' life and how God used those to give him direction and how he got off course as well as got back on course. You see, Moses is a very important man in the history of the world. If it wasn't for Moses, you wouldn't be sitting in this church today. If it wasn't for Moses, there'd be no United States of America. If there was no Moses, there'd be no capitalism in the world. Now, I know there's some people that are more socialistic say that would be a good thing. No, it wouldn't. Moses is a pivotal character in history. And we're going to look at his life and how God led his life and how he led his life and what we can learn from it. The first question being, what is really important to you? Because I don't think Moses' role as a deliverer and lawgiver would have surprised his mother. I don't think it would have. I think when she looked at him, she would have probably said, "Yep, he's the guy. He's going to deliver my people." Now let me prove that to you. Exodus chapter 1, verse 6. What's the story in the Bible has happened is God's story of creation in Genesis 1 through 12 and how the nations of the world were divided. In chapter 11 of Genesis, God calls a man named Abraham and says, "I'm going to bless the world through you, Abraham." He has a son named Isaac, and he has a son named Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons. One of them is named Joseph. And the family grows. They have a family of 70 people, and they end up going down to Egypt because there's a famine. They're living in the land of Canaan, which is Israel, and they go down into Egypt, and they live there, and there's 70 people when they live there. Joseph, who is a great-grandson of Abraham, becomes prominent in the nation, saves the whole nation from famine. The Israelites, who are 70 people, move down to Egypt, and over the next 400 years, they become a great nation. They grow, they multiply, and become a great nation in the midst of Egypt. It says in Exodus 1:6, at this time, Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly and mighty. And the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And here's the thing you need to know. When Moses was born, the fun was over. We don't know how long the prosperity lasted in Egypt, but at some point the fun times ended, and Moses was born at a time where his people were being oppressed. Things were hard. Life was not easy. The good old days were over. And when you use, excuse me, when you look at words in the text in verses 11 through 14, it uses words like bitter, taskmasters, burdens, afflicted, and rigor. Those are not good words. That's not a good definition of the time in which Moses was born. Listen to what it says. Therefore, because in verse 10, the king says, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters." A taskmaster is a slave driver. They were slaves. Let's set taskmasters over them to afflict them. Affliction's not a good thing. I said last night in the Saturday service, I said, you don't go down to bed, you don't lay down in bed, and before you go to bed, you say, I hope tomorrow I get afflicted. I hope my taskmaster puts burdens on me. These are bad words. This was a difficult time in which Moses was born. It says, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities. They built for Pharaoh, not for themselves. Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter. Say the word bitter. Bitter. Is that a good word? It doesn't even taste good, does it? Bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick. Any of you ever done brick work? You want a hard day's work? Work brickwork. The hardest day I've ever worked in my life. In my life. A friend of mine from Del Mar was building a house, and he was laying it on a cement slab. And his driveway was about 100 feet long, and it had rained for 3 days. And so when the cement truck showed up, it sank about 2 feet, and he got to the end of the runway, of the driveway, and couldn't go anymore. And we were supposed to have a group of 7 or 8 guys show up, and nobody did. It was me and Joe. Now, Joe knew what he was doing. He knew how to, lay the cement. So guess who got to carry the cement? I wheelbarrow by myself. A whole, whatever you call those cement trucks, like 7 or 8 yards of cement in a wheelbarrow. One wheelbarrow at a time. And I committed my life at that point to never do that ever again. Talk about work, my arms were touching my ankles by the time I was done. I should have tried out for a basketball team. These people did it every day. Brick and bondage and bitterness. Make a good sermon outline. Now, Moses was born in Egypt when life was hard. Life was unjust. And life was bitter. But more than that, when Moses was born, life was cheap. You see in verse 15, it says, then the king, because it didn't work, spoke to the Hebrew midwives. This is like going to the hospitals. They were where the kids were being born. They went to the hospitals, of whom the name was Shipra, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew children, mothers, and see them on their birth stools, if it's a son, then you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, then she shall let him live, her live. Life became cheap. That didn't work either, and so in verse 22, Pharaoh decided to go to all the people and said, anytime you see a Hebrew child that's male, throw him in the Nile River. Moses was born at a time where life was bitter for these people, and Moses would not have escaped if it wasn't for his mother, and maybe his father, but the story focuses on the mother. You see, Moses' birth, according to Chuck Swindoll, he says that history would turn like a hinge on this man's birth. The world would never be the same. And yet he was born at a time that if his mother hadn't come up with a plan of action, he would have died with the rest of the Hebrew children. The story continues in chapter 2, verse 1. It says, And a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. And so the woman conceived, Levi's a tribe, conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Now, the command had come from the king to kill every male child. But the mother looked at this child, much like my mother did when I was born. She looked at me and said, this is a beautiful child. No, she only did half. She looked at me and hid me for 3 months. But what mother doesn't see their child as beautiful? What makes this woman different is, according to Hebrews 11:23, this woman had faith in God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And she comes up with a plan of action. She hides him for 3 months. But the story says that she could not hide him any longer. Verse 3. And so she takes a basket and she dubs it with pitch and mortar or whatever stuff. She seals it and she puts this little ark, this little basket, in the reeds of the Nile River. Now, we don't know where she came up with this plan, but what I want you to see is this woman trusted God, but she took an action. She trusted God, but she made a plan. She didn't just wait at home waiting for God to show up. She believed God, and her faith in God motivated her to act. The great Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, put it this way: pray as though everything depends on God alone, but act as though it all depends on you alone. That's good theology. You know, when I got saved, I kind of turned away from my tradition. And I got kind of critical of a lot of church history until I had started to age and began to realize some of these guys that have gone on before us that we don't really want to pay attention to were pretty smart. You know, when I was 20 to 30, I had all the answers. Between 30 and 40, I'd realized I didn't even know the questions. Now that I'm 40 to 50, I'm realizing how smart some people really were, and this is good theology. I don't know how she came up with this plan. Maybe she read history. Do you know if she had read her history books in school, they would have talked about the birth of the Akkadian Empire, which was an empire that went before Egypt 1,000 years earlier, and how the Akkadian king was spared from death himself by his mother putting the son in a basket by the river. Maybe she read that and had faith in God, said that might work. I don't know. Maybe she looked at the religion that the people were practicing in her day. You see, the religion of her day was they believed that the Nile, the river Nile, was actually a god. And maybe she conceived the idea, said, you know, Lord, if I put him in the Nile River, they'll think when they take him out of the Nile River that the God of the Nile gave this child and maybe he'll be spared. Maybe God gave it to her in a vision. Maybe God came to her and said, put your son in the Nile and I'll save him. That's not recorded. We don't know. Or maybe it's all of them. But I suspect, as my voice changes, I suspect a major reason why she did this is that, and the plan that she had came from observing Pharaoh's daughter. As we read the next 5 verses, I want you to pay attention to how many times it says Pharaoh's daughter or a pronoun that refers to her. Watch this. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. Maybe she had seen that many times before. Maybe this was a habit and a pattern. And her, Pharaoh's daughter's maidens, walked along the riverside. And when she, Pharaoh's daughter, saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this one is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister, who was following along, according to verse 4, said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you, Pharaoh's daughter, from the Hebrew women, and that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I, and Pharaoh's daughter, will give you your wages. And the woman took the child and nursed him. I am the parent of 2 adopted children. I have a hard time reading this story without crying. It's 2 birth mothers gave life to my kids. They had a plan of action. It required faith and love. Did they get it all right? No. Have we gotten all right? No. Did Jochebed, Moses' mother, get it all right? No. But she had faith in God and a plan of action, and this plan of action worked. And Moses goes from the pit to the palace. But he wouldn't have escaped. He wouldn't have even lived if his mother had a plan. Acts chapter 7, verses 22 and 23 says Moses was trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. That means that Moses went to school at a place called the Temple of the Sun, which historians liken to our Oxford University. He got the best education, lived in the best houses, ate the best food, and had the best possible life in the midst of a time when people were dying. Life was bitter, life was hard, but Moses was spared. But Moses was spared for a reason. Now, as Moses grew, it says in verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. His name literally means drawn out of the water. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. Now, Acts 7 tells us he was 40 years of age. When Moses is 40 years of age, we'll read the rest of the story in a minute, something happens. But here's what I want you to understand. As Moses grew from a child to 40, it had been very easy for Moses to have grown bitter. Life was bitter. Life outside of Moses' heart was bitter, and it would have been very easy every day as he got up and looked outside the palace and saw his people enslaved, saw them crying out to God, burdened. It would have been very easy for Moses to get bitter towards God, bitter towards life, bitter towards everything. But instead, according to Chuck Swindoll, he says Moses could very well have turned into a bitter, angry young man. He could have held a grudge against his birth mother who gave him away, despised his new situation, fought the system, and never become the man destined for greatness. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed, he learned, he grew, he trusted, and he never forgot his roots in an eternal God. And what was happening during those 40 years in Moses' life? You see, during those 40 years, we don't have a lot of history. In fact, we don't have any history, really. But Moses began to develop a set of values. I'll show these values are number one. You find them in verses 11 through 14. See, when it came to pass, when he was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. You see, Moses developed the value of love. The love for his brethren began to move and stir in his heart till one day he had to go out and actually engage himself because of the value driving his heart. Let me tell you, folks, what's important to you will become part of your life. We do what's important to us. Ain't nobody has to get up in the morning and tell Pastor Bob to eat. I take care of that one myself. It's important to me. That refrigerator stays stocked, and if it doesn't, we stop what we're doing and we go to Walmart and we fill up with groceries. Now, I know this isn't politically correct, but we've got to get a hold of this in the church world. See, we have a gap between what we say is important and what we do. And there's a mixture. Sometimes we try to do what's important to us and fail. That's one thing, and we need to be given grace. But another side of it is we need to ask ourselves, by what we're doing, what's really important to us. And sometimes we need to repent. We need to change the values. Sometimes we have to choose something to be important even though we don't feel like it's important. It's called discipline. And that's a struggle for our culture because we have a culture that's based on feeling. When I say the word values, 90% of the people in our culture hear feeling. And that's a struggle. Feelings are wonderful when they align with what's really important. God kind of helps us with that. But Moses developed a love for his people. Moses developed a desire and a value for liberty. Moses desired a value and a desire for justice, to see justice served. And Moses developed a value of taking action. How do I know that? At 40 years of age, he went out to his brethren and he looked at their burdens. He actually looked at them, and we're going to talk about that in the next few weeks. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way. Boy, there's a verse that preaches. And when he saw no one, see, we've all done this. We've looked this way and that way, and we've killed something. And he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And he went out the second day. Behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to one who did the wrong, "Why are you striking your companion?" That's a desire for justice. Then they said, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is found out." And then he flees. But during this time, Moses develops a set of values, and I really got to hurry up here. And then he failed because he takes action. And here's the point I want you to know. One of the major points is, if you want to find your true north, values aren't enough. Values are the starting point. What's important? But because there's a disconnect between what we say and what we do, we need more than values to discover our true north. And we're going to show you 4 questions that you need to answer in order to be able to find your true north. And the first one is, what is important to me really? Not what I say, what do I do, and how do I align my values with God's values? Because since the fall of Adam, there's a disconnect there. But here's what I want you to take home. When 40 years later, and we're going to talk about Moses' failure, and we're going to deal with it, and we're going to show how it applies to our lives over the next few weeks. So we're going to skip that for today. But I want you to know, if you read the rest of this story, you'll find that Moses flees and spends 40 years in the desert, and he builds a whole new life for himself. He gets married, he has children, he has a career, he has a 401k, he has a summer home. He has an 80-inch LED TV screen. He's got 2 camels in the driveway and a swimming pool in the backyard. The man builds a life for himself. And 40 years after he has a life, God comes on the scene and says, "Hey, Moses," he sets a bush on fire. We'll look at this next week. He says, "Moses, Moses, Moses, it's time. It's time for your mission in life. It's time for your vision in life. It's time for that thing that I put in your heart 40 years ago that you screwed up royally. It's time for that thing to become a reality." And we're going to talk about why it took 40 years in the desert. But God says to Moses, and Moses shows up. God shows up and talks to Moses, and this is what he says in verse 10. I got it for time's sake. "Come now, therefore, Moses, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." 40 years earlier, that's what really was in Moses' heart. He loved his people, and he looked at their burdens. God says, "Now I will send you, Moses, and you're going to have to love your people, because you're going to have to give up 40 years of living. You're going to have to give up your 401k. You're going to have to give up your security. You're going to have to give up whatever you have in that culture now, because the minute you step outside that home and head towards Egypt, the life that you've known is over." And it takes love. It takes love to serve people in bondage. It takes love to go enter other people's pain. It takes love to get outside of our own selfish interest and invest our lives so that other people can be free. It takes love. And Moses had that value. But because he failed, he determined his failure was final. And we're going to look at that in the next few weeks. God had to resurrect his values. God said, "Go set my people free. That liberty you desired was already in your heart. You failed. You suck at it. But I'm going to be with you. And where you failed before, you won't fail this time. Go set my people free." And is it any surprise that God gave this man Moses the 10 Commandments for justice? When he tried to separate two Hebrews from each other, he was trying to implement justice. He failed, but it was a value in his heart. And yet it was this man that God gave the cornerstone, the laws, the very foundation of Western civilization. And here's what I want you to see. Moses' values and Moses' purpose in life were aligned. Because when we're born, there are things written into us from birth. There are no accidents on this planet. I don't care how you came into the earth. I haven't figured out the whole system, but I know my 2 boys are a gift from God. And they got to figure out their journey just like Moses did. And I had to figure out my journey, and you have to figure out your journey. But there are things written into our hearts. Now, sin complicates that, and we have to deal with that. But I want you to see, this is the take home for today, that when Moses was young and he botched it royally, when God finally fixed it and got it right, it was the same thing. You know, I grew up in a tradition, and I'm going to wrap it up so the praise team can come. I grew up in a legalistic tradition. Then I got saved, and I began to attend a church that made it worse. They began to teach things like, if you enjoy it, it can't be God's will in your life. They didn't really say it like that, but that's how they acted. If it was fun, it must be sinful. I've always liked to joke around and be funny or try to be funny. And I put that on the shelf for a while because I thought, God can't use humor. I've got to be holy. I interpret that now as boring. But that's got nothing to do with holiness. That was religion. And I began to realize in my first church I got religion. Now, after I got saved, guess what? They gave me religion. But then I began to grow and learn. And I began to realize, you know what? There are things God put in me. There are things God put in you that are not sinful. That I actually enjoy what God's called me to do. I actually want to preach the gospel. I could stay here another 3 hours. Your butt can't last as long as my mouth can speak. And I enjoy it. Now I'll pay a price for saying the word but in church. And what's interesting to me is in my life, the very things that God put in me as a young man are beginning to manifest in my life. And I see that in Moses. And I want to see that in you. And as we'll see over the next few weeks, there's a reason why some of you aren't doing it. Because failure's gotten in the way. Religion's gotten in the way. Negativity's gotten in the way. Oh, you can't do that. Why not? That's the question I ask now. Why not? Why not here? Why not now? Why not us? Because like Moses, I've been on the backside of the desert, and so have many of you. And I've had 40 years, quote. Not really, but you know what I mean. And so have you to look at how you mess things up. And I believe there's many of us in this congregation that God's saying, yeah, you messed it up. Learn. But let it go. Because the time has come that I want to begin a new phase in your lives. Where those things that really are deep within you that I have put in there, I want to begin to mine and to bring up and to bring into reality in the earth. It is the time. Now is the time that I'm visiting you. The bush is burning. God is looking for those who will turn aside and say, I need to find out what this bush thing's about. Father, I pray for this people. The hour is upon us. I believe with all my heart that the eyes of the Lord are running to and fro, looking for those that you can be strong on behalf of. That there are people that you have planted dreams and visions and missions in their lives that they've been dormant. And they've accepted life in the desert. They've accepted being a shepherd. They've accepted, Lord, that lifestyle. And now you're calling them to something greater, something they were originally made to do. And I pray, Father, for the faith, your faith to come into our hearts And for that spark, like a pilot light on a stove, to light. Because there is no potential for a flame until that first spark lights that pilot light. And so I pray that light would be lit over these next 4 weeks. And Lord, you have more for us than just meets the eye. Father, we thank you. In Jesus' name.